As the population continues to age, and between now and 3:30, we will have all aged 5 hours or whatever that is. As the population continues to age, with the fastest subset of our aging population is over the age of 85, and they're women, ladies. And so as the population continues to age, and the needs of that aging population will continue to increase, and that aging population is saying, I want something different. I don't want to live in a nursing home or an institutional setting. It is extremely important that we begin to talk about what that means. So, having said that, you can go ahead and... These objectives are really, really lean, because really what I want you to leave here with is understanding the driving force behind home community-based services and why they are so important and how they started. And then before we talk about a successful model, I meant to start my stop clock so I'll know when to stop. Let's do that. I want to be very conscious because I know I stand between you and lunch.
Is there a clicker up there?
Yes, but I can't. Well, I can still control it. Okay, very good. And so before I talk about successful models, I'm going to talk a little bit about caregivers. So let me ask a question. How many of you here are caregivers for a loved one, an older adult, a neighbor, somebody in your church? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. And so we're going to talk a little bit about caregivers and the importance of caregivers. Then we'll talk about a successful model of home and community-based services. And I'm going to use PACE as an example, which stands for Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly, because that's the model I know the most about. And then we'll look at the future. And this is really where I will leave you. I will not have an answer for you at the end of this presentation. Quite the contrary. At the end of this presentation, I will leave you challenged with what does the future look like as it relates to home and community-based care, advancing care for older adults, and PVM. What's the relationship and what should that look like? Do I have to point to? See, I don't know. So when the question I'm going to ask everybody this morning, because we're talking about home and community-based services, is what is home? Where is home? So is this home? Is this home? Maybe this is home. Or is this home? So how many of you would say that each of the photos that you've seen represent home? Yeah, I think we would all agree. So then I want to read to you a definition of home. And I like this definition because I really think it captures the true meaning of home. A home is a place of refuge. A person's most personal belongings are kept in a home, and it's where a person feels safe and accepted. A home tells a story and expresses a person or family interest. To create a home requires an emotional connection and sense of belonging, not the physical things, but an emotional connection and sense of belonging. So irrespective of where home is really not about brick and mortar. Now, brick and mortar becomes important, and we'll talk more about that as we look at affordable housing and places for people to live who want to live independently. But home really is about dignity, about a place of safety, about a place that you can call your own. You can take your shoes off or you can keep your shoes on. You can have a pet, you can get up when you want, you can go to bed when you want. So home really is about the individual having choices and a sense of independence. So I thought what I would do is start with where the whole concept of home and community-based services started. And some of you may be familiar with this. I wasn't until I started doing my research. But in 1960, Long-Term Care Services and Support started a movement for deinstitutionalization. And at that particular time, it wasn't really centered around older adults. It was around intellectually dependent, developmentally dependent, and sometimes mental illness. These were the folks that were saying, we don't want to be institutionalized. We want to have the right to be able to live independently. So that's when that movement started. It was only later that older adults became a part of that movement. Oh, let me go back, I'm sorry. And so in 1983, Congress added a section to the Social Security Act that allowed states to have the option to have waivers as rules of governing institutions. So all of a sudden, there was an opportunity to say there's a waiver that will allow you to provide these services. In 1990, oh, I'm sorry, did someone ask me a question? I'm sorry. Okay. In 1992, home and community-based services for the elderly and the disabled actually became a waiver program. And then not until 2005 did home and community-based become a formal Medicaid state plan, where now Medicaid would actually pay for home and community-based services, but states had the option to use these waivers to be able to provide people what they needed so that they could stay in their homes and be independent. So important. So who was home and community-based services initially intended for? It was intended for those people who perhaps needed to be in a nursing home to get care, but not just nursing homes. This slide should also include anybody that required institutional care. That's who it was originally determined, or that was the reason it was originally developed. And then, of course, individuals who had functional and cognitive limitations, those who needed help with physical disabilities, intellectual development, developmental disabilities, mental illness, and finally for the elderly. So it's interesting that when this movement first started, it really wasn't for elderly, but now the elderly who stood up and said, hold on, I also want to be able to make a choice about where I live. I also want to live independently. And you know, there's something about living independently that many of us don't think about. And we don't think about it because living independently to us comes natural. Would most of you agree with that? So we don't think about somebody saying, I want to be independent in where I live and how I live. So once the home and community-based services sort of became this formal option through Medicaid for state plans, they had to come up with something that they called their final rules. And number one, it was that this should be community-based services, that these services should support people with multiple complex medical, psychosocial, functional needs who needed not only health care, but also needed social help to be able to stay independent. And then inherent is this, that every individual has a right to live in the community. This is an inherent right. They have the right to say that I want to live in the community. They have the right to personal-centered care planning, which means it's care planning that's around what they want, not around what we want. And as a physician, I have to tell you that sometimes when we put care plans together, it's around what we think is best for them. It's not necessarily what they want. And then, of course, finally, they should have the freedom to make those decisions. There are challenges to living independently, especially when we talk about the groups that we're referencing. There are challenges. Shortages of services, first of all, and that's going to be something that you'll hear over and over again, not just from me, but as you continue to follow what's going on with home and community-based services, especially with caregivers. Both direct caregivers, those are the folks that we pay, and with family caregivers, those shortages will impact the ability for people to live independent. Housing shortages, well, when I hear about all the wonderful housing that PVM has, that is amazing. But when you look at this population that would qualify for these waivers, there is a shortage of housing. Medicaid does not pay for room and board, and it does not pay rent. And if you happen to have a disability, your housing options are even less. especially if you have limited resources. So housing will continue to be an issue, and that's one of the areas where PVM has an opportunity as a part of your strategic plan. How might you impact the ability to have adequate housing for those who need it so much? And then, of course, for home and community-based services, there's a waiting list, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what are the services that you get from home and community-based? Well, there are two aspects. There are the human services, and those support daily living. And again, they're things that we take for granted. Activities of daily living, helping with personal care, maybe providing a meal, doing some housekeeping, perhaps providing transportation. There are all of these things that are included under home and community-based services. And again, if the individual qualifies, these are things that will be provided and will be covered under the waiver. Then there are health services, and this is intended to meet the medical or health needs of individuals, and those are very detailed as well, right down to hospice. I heard somebody talk about hospice, that's right down to hospice or comfort care. So if there are specific health needs, home and community-based services are intended to also meet those needs. So what are the benefits of home and community-based services? Well, number one, it actually is less expensive than having people in institutional settings like nursing homes. So yeah, it's less expensive, but I think the greatest value is not the dollars. I think the greatest value is the dignity. And I think I heard Johnny mention that. It's really about dignity. People want dignity, and when you have choices over where you live and how you want to live, it's about dignity, and that's quality of life. And actually, that can expand our lives. It can help people live longer. We're not going to stop aging, but we can disrupt aging. So it's really about dignity and how we live our lives. Culturally responsive, spiritual and cultural activities that are consistent with what the individual wants, familiarity with the environment because now you're in your own home, can provide counseling and other things that will help that individual live independently. And of course, sometimes, this is one of the areas with Biden's new plan, perhaps even be able to help the informal or family caregivers maybe be compensated for the time that they're spending taking care of their loved one. But like everything else, not only are there benefits, there are some challenges. And those challenges, I'm going to go to the second one because I really feel like that is the one that we're going to have to really face most in the next few years to the next 10 years, is going to be availability of qualified caregivers. People who want to do it, people who feel like they're going to be paid to do it. Caregiver burnout. So a number of you raised your hands when I asked how many of you are caregivers. Is anybody brave enough to raise their hand if they've experienced any caregiver burnout? Anybody brave enough? Okay, thank you for being brave enough. Caregiver burnout is real, and why is that so significant? Because if the caregiver burns out, who will take care of that individual that is relying on that caregiver to maintain them in the community, to maintain their life, to maintain their wellness? So that is important. Lack of 24/7 medical professional availability, and it goes on and on and on. The challenges, I don't feel outweigh the benefits, but we have to address each of these challenges. We have to address them because they are important if we want to continue to move forward. Oh, I went backwards because I think the benefits are so important. That's why I went backwards. And that was a mistake, but it's okay. So what about, where are we today? Presently, actually, I looked this up again last night, probably closer to 4 million people receive some home and community-based services. Now, that number is probably tripled in terms of the number of people that need it and may be eligible for it. But we have a large number of folks presently that are receiving it. But this is the downside. There is probably more than 800,000 people on the waiting list to get home and community care services. And why is that? Because you need to have staff, you need to have the resources to be able to provide those services. And unfortunately, the waiting list can be upwards of 3 years, 39 months. So what happens if somebody is eligible, but there's no home and community-based service available for them? What happens to that individual? Somebody tell me, what happens to them? They end up in a nursing home or they die. They end up in a nursing home, they end up in the hospital, or worse, they die. So we've got some work to do in terms of having the resources and the manpower that's needed so that we can continue to provide this service. The other fact is, I think all of you know this, nursing home occupancy rates have decreased pre-pandemic versus post-pandemic. The nursing home occupancy rates have decreased, and this is not a bash on nursing homes because they serve a role, but there are a number of people now who are resistant, reluctant, whether it's the individual or whether it's their caregiver, to put them in a nursing home. And again, the beauty of the home and community-based services is we may be able to keep that person out of the nursing home and provide them the services that they need. I want to jump just for a minute and talk about caregivers, because this is so important. These are just some caregiver facts, and many of you probably know these better than me. When we talk about direct caregivers, we're talking about professionals that are paid. When we talk about family, or we talk about, let me progress my screen. When we talk about family or what they call informal caregivers, those are not paid. But I'm going to jump down a little bit, because when you look at, in 2017, 41 million of the caregivers were unpaid. Look at the number of hours that equated to. That equated to 34 billion hours of caregiving. Look at the dollars that equated to. $470 billion. These are unpaid caregivers. These are those of you who raised your hands and many others. And then in 2020, 53 million unpaid caregivers. 50 billion hours of caregiving. And more than $500 billion that it takes to be able to provide that level of caregiving. Caregivers, both professional caregivers or direct caregivers, and informal caregivers will continue to decrease as the population continues to age. It's estimated that baby boomers between now and 2060, and by the way, a statistic is every day 10,000 people turn 65, and that's supposed to occur between now and 2030. 10,000 people turn 65, will turn 65 every day. So the number of folks over the age of 65 will continue to increase. But again, I mentioned earlier, those over the age of 85 will triple. So our oldest population will continue to age in place. And 70% of people over the age of 65 at some point will need home and community-based services. It sounds depressing, but I've got good news for you. I kind of want you to know what the facts are and the statistics are, and then we talk about what our opportunities are. So we've got some work to do, both in terms of direct caregivers and informal caregivers. So I'm going to talk about a motto now. We talk about a motto that has used home and community-based services known as PACE, Program of All-Inclusive Care for the Elderly. And this program actually has utilized home and community-based services to make a difference in the life of older adults who are all 100% nursing home eligible. Not some of them are nursing home eligible, they are 100% nursing home eligible. It identifies a need. They have to meet the criteria for enrollment, which is at least 55 years or older. They must meet a level of care to be in a nursing home. That's why I say 100% of the folks that come into PACE are nursing home eligible. And then there's funding through Medicaid and Medicare that allows PACE to provide those services. We provide oversight. There's an interdisciplinary team that provides the care and oversight and planning to make certain that we keep those people in the community and that we keep them safe. So what is PACE? It's an integrated system of care for frail elders. starting at age 55. Now, some of you may say, I don't consider myself elder at 55. Oh, well, that is the cutoff for coming into PACE. And by the way, I joined AARP. I think now have they put it down to 50? What age is it? It's 50, yeah. So I think I joined AARP when I was 50. I'm very proud to be an AARP member. Oh, yeah, okay, I'm definitely north of 48. And then it's community-based, it's comprehensive, capitated, and it's coordinated. But how does PACE really work? When you look at this next slide, this looks just like the community or the human element of home and community-based services and the health element, because that's what PACE does. It meets all of the human elements, and it also meets the health elements to keep those individuals independent and safe where they want to be, which is in the community. And if you ask any elderly person where they want to be, they'll tell you there is no place like home. It doesn't matter what home looks like, and it doesn't matter the neighborhood that home is in. They want to be in home. So these are some of the services, the core services that are provided by PACE. This is an infographic that really shows you really what PACE can do. First of all, look at the purple strip in the middle. It says 95% of these individuals live in the community. Remember what I said, 100% of them are eligible to be in a nursing home. Yet we keep 95% of them in the community with the support and services, both from the human services perspective and the medical or health services perspective. We continue to grow now with 60,000 participants being cared for, but that's only about 2.7% of all of the individuals who would qualify for this program, both from their socioeconomic status as well as nursing home eligibility. And then the average age is 77, 69% women, 31% men. Why is it 69% women? Can anybody tell me why 69% of the women in PACE, of the participants are women? Tell me why. She says because women, the guys, you stand up for this. She said because men don't go to the doctors. They don't take care of themselves. That's not quite what she said. She said women go to the doctor and take care of themselves. That's part of it. Women tend to live longer because they do tend to be healthier because typically they do take better care of themselves. They do. So we have the largest percentage of women, smaller percentage of men. And I want you to look at that bottom part, if you can see it. 33% of people in a PACE program need help in 5 to 6 activities of daily living. That's a lot. So they need somebody to help them with all of those things. And typically, when you need that much help in activities of daily living, where are you? In a nursing home. So again, 95% in the community, 5 to 6 assistants in activities of daily living, yet we're able to maintain them safely in the community. Isn't that pretty amazing? And that's one of the opportunities when we look at how can home and community-based services actually be a model that impacts the quality and the care of the participants and older adults. This is also important. The state's PACE programs 13% less it costs the state for PACE than if they use those Medicaid dollars for nursing homes and other types of environments. And the quality, I shouldn't say the quality is better in PACE. I'll just say that, again, if people had the option, they would rather be at home. And if we can make that happen, we can. And Roger, by the way, I can also make because I noticed some people are taking notes, I'm happy to make the PowerPoint available. I'm happy to do that. So what is the success element for PACE? It really has to do with this interdisciplinary team. We have a group of people that come together, they identify issues, they work together, they put plans in place, and they make certain that we keep individuals at home. I need to keep track. And that is extremely important. But now I actually want to share a story with you, because now I want you to actually see how it works. So several years ago, we had a 60-year-old woman who had stage 4 non-small cell metastatic lung cancer. In addition, she had a thyroid disease. She had a history of substance abuse. She was bipolar and depressed. She was in pain because of her metastatic cancer. And all in all, she felt alone and lost. When she came to PACE, interestingly, she had continued to be followed by a large health system that continued to manage her non-curable stage 4 metastatic lung cancer. And not once had anybody had a discussion about what she wanted, about her goals of care. Rather, they continued to do diagnostic tests. They continued to offer her treatments. Even though the treatments were making her sick, they weren't helping her because she was dying. Not once had somebody had that conversation with her. So when she came into our program, the first thing we did is we started talking to her about what is important to you. She had a lot of regrets because she felt like she had made bad choices during her life, and she really felt like she was now suffering because of bad decisions and bad choices that she had made during her life. And so she had this unresolved pain that if she had taken better care of herself, her life wouldn't be like this. She also expressed to us that she did not want to continue to live like this, but nobody had ever given her the option of what she wanted. When she was going to that large health system for her appointments, she caught the bus. No one had ever offered her a cab voucher or even inquired about how do you get to your appointments. And she caught the bus to those appointments. So we started talking about what was really important. She wanted to get some spiritual closure, so we had our chaplain spend time with her to talk about, what do you want to talk about? What does resolution look like to you? We addressed her pain and the multiple medications that she was on. They were actually conflicting each other, so we had our clinical pharmacists review those medications and get rid of most of them. We had our behavioral health person talk to her about her depression and the deep-seated need that she had to be able to talk about the choices that she had made, the bad choices. And we did that with her. She lived in a home where she had minimal of what she needed to really survive and live well, including she didn't have a refrigerator, and it was coming up to Thanksgiving. And so one of the things that we did is we rallied together. We got her a refrigerator and some other furnishings. Because she had had chemotherapy, she had lost all of her hair, and that was a dignity thing. Hey, ladies, that's a dignity thing, right? And so what the nurses did is they got together and they bought her a Tina Turner wig. Ah, man, that made all the difference. What's love got to do with it, got to do with it? So they got her a Tina Turner wig. And those simple things made such a difference in her quality of life. But here was the biggest thing. She finally resolved that, yes, she had made some mistakes. But even with those mistakes, she could be forgiven. That God would forgive her. And she needed to forgive herself. And so we put all of those things in place. And she said, I don't want any more of these treatments. So we enrolled her into our comfort care, which is equivalent to hospice. And just 3 months after being in our program, she died. She had a quality death. She was at where she wanted because she was at home. She knew she was loved and cared for. All of the resources and things that she needed, we put in place. And so we looked at the impact that home and community-based services within the setting of a PACE program could make on the life of an individual. We made her last 3 months probably better than her last 60 years had been, and we gave her a quality death. Do you know that you can have a good death just like you can have a good life? We were able to do that. And I'm reminded of the scripture in Mark where Jesus said, when you do this as unto the least of these, you do it as unto me. So we had a phenomenal opportunity to change an individual, but our ability to have creative funding, our ability to have a team, our ability to focus on exactly what she needed. This is what you call patient-centered. It was what she needed, when she needed it, and we honored it. So that's one of the success stories. We have many success stories. We have medical students that rotate through PACE, and they talk about they can't believe that PACE is able to do the types of things that we do that will impact the lives of these older adults. So what does the future look like? That's what you want to talk about for the next few minutes. What does the future look like for home and community-based services? The resources are slim, and we need to talk about how we can, yes, increase those resources, but how can we maximize resources? How can we be creative about how we provide resources to those who need them? Staffing is a challenge, and people will continue to leave the human services industry. Caregivers will either burn out or caregivers will die. How will we manage staffing going forward? Governmental support of family. Okay, Biden has some things in place, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but how do we support family caregivers? Because remember, they're the ones that make up over 30 billion hours of care. How do we compensate them? So just quickly, Biden's American Rescue Act, some of you may be familiar with this, but this is how the money is being distributed. $750 million for meals, $460 million for home and community-based services, which will include vaccinations and address the effects of extended isolation. Now, I want to stop there for a minute, because one of the scientific journals that we use as physicians in geriatrics is called the American Journal of Geriatrics. And in August of 2022, there was an article called Bad Company. That's the title of the article. Bad Company, and what it was is it showed loneliness as a longitudinal predictor for symptoms of the cluster of pain, fatigue, and depression. So when people are lonely or isolated or without socialization, the bad company can translate to pain, fatigue, and depression. Pretty powerful. So again, when we talk about what kinds of things can we put in place to help eliminate pain, fatigue, and depression, home and community-based services can do that. $140 million for helping family caregivers. I don't know yet what that's going to look like, but that is extremely important and probably not enough, but it may be a good start. And then $10 million to go into long-term care facilities. I'm going to close now with talking about, so what are the future challenges, PVM? This is a part of your strategic goal. What are some of the future challenges? How do we make certain that the services that are needed continue to be available? How do we continue to enhance, grow is not the right word, but empower people to want to be direct caregivers? Now, one of my thoughts is, wouldn't it be interesting if that anyone that wants to go into a healthcare profession like nursing and physicians and OT/PT, if a part of their learning track required that they shadow and spend time with a caregiver? It can be a direct caregiver or it could be a personal caregiver. And what does that do? It allows them to see firsthand what it takes to be a caregiver, and then that may change their mindset in terms of how they respond to family members especially. So wouldn't that be an interesting way to enhance the future of direct caregivers, is if it was mandatory. If you were going to be a doctor, it is mandatory that you spend a month shadowing a caregiver or even working as a caregiver. Wouldn't that be kind of, it would be thinking out of the box, but I think it's something that we should consider. Somebody agrees with that, huh? Yeah, good. I think we should do it. We'll talk about that. Roger. And then, of course, the numbers of unpaid caregivers will continue to increase. So here are our opportunities, creative ways to maintain independence. And I know that as direct caregivers and even informal caregivers decrease, we are going to need to be creative with caregivers. We're going to need to look at robotic and virtual and other types of systems, remote systems that will also provide some of the caregiving needs. I'm not certain yet how you would do robotic if somebody needs help toileting. I don't know how you do that yet, but we'll keep thinking about it, right? But we need to be creative about how we're going to be able to maintain independence. That next word should be track with a K. As direct care workers, they must track or spend time, anybody going into a healthcare profession, anybody, it is a mandatory requirement that you spend some time with a direct care worker. Walk in their shoes, in other words. Walk in their shoes. Unpaid caregivers will see what types of resources may be available. But you know something? There's another way to acknowledge unpaid caregivers. It's great if you can compensate them, but for those of you who are unpaid or informal caregivers, what might be another way that would validate your value? What might be something else that we could do that would show you that you're appreciated? I know they have a National Caregivers Day, and that's great, but what other things could we do for informal caregivers that would help them feel validated or appreciated? Anybody? We've got this indirect caregiver who spoke over there. Somebody tell me. What else could we do? Respite. Somebody say give them a break. Respite, and make certain that the respite is paid for, right? What else could we do for indirect and informal caregivers to make them feel validated or valued? Say it again. Health insurance, absolutely. Because unfortunately, many of them, based on what their status is, their employment, they may not have health insurance. Anything else that we might be able to do to help validate unpaid? Okay, that's excellent. So being able to make certain that what they need, when they need it, it is available, and they're not coming out of pocket, and they're not avoiding taking care of themselves because they don't have insurance. Because if that caregiver gets sick and goes into the hospital, then the person that they're caring for will likely end up either in a nursing home or maybe even worse. I want to know, what else can we do to validate, support, bring value to informal caregivers?
Training and education.
Training and education. And it's training not just to be a caregiver, but training possibly to promote them or elevate them, and so that they could find employment and do other things.
Hugs and kisses and a lending an ear.
How simple is that? I don't know if you guys heard it, but he said hugs and kisses and validating the importance of their work. Thank you, Brian. Yeah.
Somehow
Shonda.
interfacing with their employers and making their employers sensitive to what they had, the additional burden or that they have taken on with respect to a family member, and somehow making their employer understand what they're going through, and maybe changing work kind of schedule to accommodate their responsibilities at home. Just really bringing their employers in to understand this is happening, and maybe you need to make some accommodations.
Exactly. And LaDonna, that basically often will fall into the realm of HR, right? And that's one of the things I was thinking about. How often do we really acknowledge, and I know we have FMLA and other things, but how often do we really acknowledge the impact of that informal caregiver and keeping that individual in the community? So looking at other ways to acknowledge them and support them so they're not penalized because they have to be off work. They're not penalized.
I'll just add to what was said behind me in terms of lending an ear, because I'm not sure everybody wants to get kissed post-COVID. but there's a lot of technological ways to lend an ear, and caregivers need that validation 24/7. And I think that service providers need to hear what it is that caregivers are struggling with. So I think there could be a format that, just like we saw the great virtual tour, there could be virtual ways for people to, just like TikTok or whatever else there's out there, but it's like that venting that people need to do, and they could do it anonymously or whatever, and then collecting what you hear the needs are. And that could be certainly actually more than just nationwide even. And that would give more direction to providing the services that are, the training, et cetera, that's
Okay,
needed.
very good. And I think if I can extrapolate that, we're talking about informal caregivers, and I think they're important because they're going to be a big piece of who cares for them. We can apply some of those principles to direct caregivers too, because many of them are leaving the industry because they don't feel paid, they don't feel valued, they don't have insurance or other benefits. So I think we can also extend that to that group as well.
Yeah, and I'm actually focused on those informal ones, the non-paid ones.
Yes.
I learned the lesson from a funeral director several years back who brought me into, when I had come in to help somebody else, a family member, set up a funeral. He said, wait, I want to show you something. And he brought me in where there was already someone laid out in their casket and everything. He said, that, and he said to me at the time, I was a lot younger, that young lady is a caregiver. I bury more caregivers before the person they give care to than I ever want. And he said he went back to his own mom and said, Mom, I'm not going to be your caregiver because then I'll be gone before you. So that's something that we don't talk enough about, and that's happens more often than you want to know.
Yeah.
In fact, we do need to know. We probably need to know that.
We need to talk about it more. I agree. And when you look at the statistics, caregivers are more likely to be hospitalized, stress, depression, premature death than the individual that they're caring for. So that's true. There was another comment here. Yes.
We have to make sure that we ask the caregivers what they need and not assume what they need.
Good.
We all have stories of people who were given, they may have given you, dinner out when you just needed to sleep. So we can't assume for the paid or the unpaid caregivers.
That's an excellent point. Don't assume, just like we shouldn't assume that even though an older person's home looks like maybe the second house that I showed you, don't assume that they have a problem with that. That's often our assumption. So we do need to not assume what caregivers need and ask them what they need so that we can make certain we're addressing what their needs and concerns are. Thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
I'm going to add that you need some kind of a daycare voucher or some kind of system in a community where when you are urgently needed as a caregiver and you have small children, that there's just no support for what do you do with your kids.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point, because when you look at the statistics on caregivers, especially informal, 56% of them are still working, and they have children at home. So that's what we call the sandwich generation. So being able to make certain that we put processes in place that will be able to support them. Absolutely, thank you. Katrina, is that you? Yeah.
Dr. Graddy, it's me. As a former caregiver, like you just said, come and clean my house, do my laundry, deliver my groceries so I can take care of my parents.
Man.
Oh, and transport the kid to all his stuff.
That's good. Okay, absolutely. And we laugh at, okay, somebody else was going to say something? Yes, please.
Oh, okay. All right. So I was thinking for informal caregivers, oftentimes they're on very fixed incomes themselves. So they don't have the resources to get new bedpans or bed sheets or have the time to prepare those meals for those that can't prepare themselves. So offering deeply discounted medical devices or assistance, or even free at some point in time.
Very good. Thank you. These are all great suggestions for informal caregivers, and some of these will also apply to direct caregivers, because we don't want all of the direct caregivers to quit either. So thank you for all of the input on those. And so again, virtual, digital, robotic, remote, we're looking for other things moving forward as the number of informal caregivers and direct caregivers, those numbers continue to decrease, but the population that will need those services continue to increase. And I think this is my last slide. So we'll be looking at how will we be able to creatively provide care to this population. Will it be robotic? For socialization, we know the impact of isolation. Will it be digital? What will it look like? So here's the question I leave with us for today as we're looking forward to our strategic plan for home and community-based services. What does the future look like? I can't answer that I can only say that it's within each of us to determine what, not only what does it look like, but what role will we play in making certain that it occurs. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to spend time with you this morning. It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Roger, and God bless you all.